So how do you how do you apply or how do you renew an ITIN? How do you apply for it or how do you renew your ITIN? Well, it's kind of the same thing. So there is a form. It is a one-page form that you have to fill out, and you have to fill out this same form whether you're renewing your ITIN or whether you're first applying. And on its face, this form looks very simple. Any of you out there can Google it. It's a W7, W as in walrus number 7. And it is a one-page form that looks deceivingly simple. And it basically asks for your name. And I've got the copy of that. Let's go to that. So here it is. If you Google it, it'll come up, but if it doesn't come up through Google, you'll see it at the IRS website, irs.gov, and it is a one-page form, and as I said, it surprisingly looks simple, but it is more complicated to try to fill this thing out. So one page, and as you can see in the upper right hand corner, there's a box, and that is a box that you need to check one of the boxes inside of it. And apparently this is one of the big errors that people make. They don't check either of these boxes. So you're either checking the box to say you're applying for a new ITIN, so that means you don't currently have an ITIN, or the other alternative is that you're renewing an existing ITIN. So this is the same form that you would use to renew or to apply for your ITIN. Then on the next area, there's a whole bunch of boxes A through H, and you're going to check one of those. And this is the complication, I would say. So you're checking why you need an ITIN. And the federal government, as I said, they're not going to issue an ITIN to you unless you need an ITIN, unless they believe you need an ITIN for tax filing. Ileana and I and Catherine Ginn have gone around and around with this frustration because to get the ITIN, you have to have a tax reporting obligation. So you can't get the ITIN before you have income. So many people want to get the ITIN to start their business and to maybe open bank accounts or get business licenses or other type of entrepreneurial activities, maybe get a taxpayer ID number for your business. Many people want the ITIN to start their business, and unfortunately, you cannot get an ITIN unless you have a tax reporting obligation, which means you already, are working or generating income through a business. So it's after the fact, and in fact, in order to apply for an ITIN, in 99% of the cases, you need to submit this one-page form with a tax return. So that means you have a tax filing obligation, and you can only get the ITIN with a tax return. So I work with a lot of individuals across this country, many of whom Ileana introduces me to, who have a myriad of different situations where someone says to them, you need an ITIN in order for us to continue to have a relationship with you. And that person doesn't have a tax obligation So we can't file a request for an ITIN. So let me give you it. So I've had this conversation too many times, very frustrating for everybody. And so I will tell you about my most recent one. And that is a individual who was a refugee, and she was in the country receiving some assistance from a nonprofit she was a victim of domestic violence, and she was receiving housing and some training from a nonprofit that was trying to help her get back on her feet. Of course, that makes so much sense, to get her back on a path to healing. And the nonprofit was pushing her to get an ITIN, and they said, we cannot provide you with any more support unless you have a taxpayer identification number. Well, she clearly could not get a social security number at this point, and there was no way I could confidently file an ITIN application for her, because I knew it would be rejected. So it was not a good allocation of resources. So what I suggested to her was to have the people from the nonprofit contact me, have her introduce them to me. I am a tax attorney, I'm a CPA, I'm a law professor, and I have been thinking about these issues for a long period of time, and I can tell her and I can point her to the directions of the Form W-7 explicitly describe she qualify for an ITIN. So she did that, and I will tell you, the woman from the nonprofit did contact me, and I asked her to call me, and we had a voice-to-voice conversation, and then I sent her the links to the instructions for this form, and I think that was a very good way to try to work this situation out, rather than just trying to file for it and then having the IRS reject it and keep going back and forth. Just have a meaningful conversation. And I'm hoping, I haven't heard that it didn't work, so I'm hoping that that worked. So now back to these boxes. So there's many reasons, as I said, to get a taxpayer identification number. If you're a non-resident alien, and so that is someone who is not physically present in the United States, is not a US citizen, and they need an ITIN to get some sort of treaty benefit. So there are some people who are here on a visa who maybe are working as a teacher, but they're not a citizen, they're not counted as being physically present. They get treaty benefits, and they need to get an ITIN, and so they can check that box and get it. So I am looking at the questions. I apologize. So an ITIN is an ITIN does not have the letter I in front of it. It has a number. So it looks very similar to a social security number, except the first digit is always a 9. And it does not have an I in front of it. And it does not come on a Social Security card. And it also is not issued by the Social Security Administration. It is issued by the Internal Revenue Service, and it is issued by the Internal Revenue Service solely to be able to file your tax return. And proof of income does not need be, well, this is a good question from someone, and that is that in order to get the ITIN, you have to file the ITIN form with a tax return, which basically proves that you have a tax reporting obligation. And so, for example, if somebody right now is filing their 2019 individual income tax return, so in 2020, of course, we file our 2019 individual income tax return. So if you had income in 2019 and you don't have an ITIN or a social security number, you would now file that tax return with this form W-7 and some additional documents I'm going to tell you about. You have to do it manually. You have to do it to a specific address. You don't file it electronically. You don't file it the typical address. You have to send it down to a specific address in Texas, and they will then issue you an ITIN, and they'll process that tax return with your new ITIN. See, because you're having to file a tax return without a taxpayer identification number, so you're going to have to do that manually. So these are excellent questions. Keep them coming. So back to this W-7 form. So the first box doesn't typically apply to any of our community. The second box, B, doesn't apply to our community either, because that's going to be a foreign investor who's not present in the United States, but they have US source income, and so they're going to have to file a tax return. So that's not us. Box C is typically us, and that is a US resident alien. So for tax purposes, this term is a resident alien is somebody who's physically present in the United States for more than 183 days, counted the way that I described it, at least 31 days of the current year, and then we count every day this year 100%. We count the years, the days the year before, only 33%. And then we count the days the prior year, only 1/6 of each day. And so anyone who is in the United States for more than half the year, 183 days, they are a US, who is not a citizen, who is not a legal permanent resident. For tax purposes, they are treated as a US resident alien. And they have to file a US federal tax return. And as I said, maybe be careful what you ask for, because if you are a US resident alien, you not only have to pay taxes on your US source income, but on your worldwide income. But that box C is typically the box that we check on this form. Then the next two boxes, D and E, I will tell you, after the current administration significantly changed the tax laws, those next two boxes have gotten more complicated. So this is box D and E. So you might need an ITIN because you're a dependent of a US citizen or a resident alien. So for example, if we have dad who is an unauthorized immigrant who's working in the United States, and he has children who do not qualify for a social security number, those children are dependent, if they live in the household for the entire year and they don't support themselves, he supports them, those are dependents of not a US citizen, but of a resident alien. And so we would apply for an ITIN for them. And what has become more scrutinized is under the current form, it says you have to enter the name and the ITIN number of this person. So you would enter dad's name and dad's ITIN number, and it also asks for the relationship. The W-7 form was just changed last summer, and it now asks for the relationship of the dependent. So if it's a child, you would put child. So someone is asking me, so it doesn't expire so long as taxes are always filed. That is correct. So if you are filing a tax return, your ITIN will not expire. However, if your ITIN was issued before 2013 and has the middle digits of 70 through 87, that's how the federal government identifies these ITINs, it has expired. And any ITIN that was issued before 2013 that doesn't have the numbers 70 through 87, it might be expiring this year, and the date that number will expire. We'll find out what the middle digits are in probably around May, maybe earlier. And those numbers will expire as of the end of 12/31/2020. So I don't believe they've gotten through all of the ones that have been issued prior to 2013. My experience is, because we have not had a porous border for so long, most of the people I work with that have ITINs were issued before 2013. So a lot of them, tens of millions of them, have expired. Can you use an ITIN to get a credit card? Well, I guess that depends upon the credit card company. I believe some individuals with ITINs are getting credit cards. That really is something, that's a private issue. That is a private contract with these banks typically. And so you can certainly try it. I know lots of individuals have, to the extent they have a credit record. So people have been doing it. Let's see, US resident alien is a very different term than I'm used to. That is true. I'm telling you, that is a tax term. So that is not the same as immigration law, but it is written in the tax code. So I'm using it as it's written in law. So in a U.S. resident alien is somebody who is a physical presence test. So we count the number of days you've been in the United States. And if you've been in the United States for more than 183 days in a 3-year period, counting the days as I described, then for tax purposes, you're a U.S. resident alien. And you would need to file a tax return. And if you don't qualify for a Social Security number, then you need to get an ITIN. And how do you do that? With this form and with a tax return. Folks who are, and quite often, sometimes this comes up if somebody is in removal proceedings and they need to demonstrate that they've been in the United States for 10 years. If that person is not a tax filer, we often work with immigration lawyers to file back tax returns for 10 years, and we have to get them an ITIN. Needless to say, immigration judges want somebody to file in a timely manner and pay all their taxes. And in fact, immigration judges that I work with, they look at tax compliance. That's why we encourage tax compliance. I know Immigrants Rising does as well. We encourage complete and thorough tax filing because we want you to be compliant and pay your taxes currently to the extent they're due. And immigration judges often look at tax compliance as good moral character. So that's important. Um, so now back to this W-7. So if you are dependent, it's harder to get an ITIN, but you certainly do qualify. But you have to provide the name and the social security number or the ITIN of the person whose tax return you're going to be on, and then that W-7 form for the dependents would go on the tax return. Similarly, if you're a spouse, if you're the wife or husband of a US citizen that has a tax filing obligation, then you need to get an ITIN if you're going to be on that tax return. And the form asks for the name and the taxpayer ID of your spouse. And so if you already have an ITIN and it expires, you're going to use, and then you renew it, it's the same ITIN. You keep that same number. So that's another good question. So the boxes that I typically see our ITIN holders use are C, D, and E. A non-resident alien student, that's somebody here who's probably on a visa. And so that's not the community we're talking about. Other dependents, spouses of somebody. So I've worked with, in Nevada, we have often a lot of immigrants who come here to teach our K through 12 education, and they often have visas. They need an ITIN to file a tax return, but they're not residents. They're not treated as residents. So their kids need ITINs. So a spouse can get an ITIN if they don't have any income, if they are filing with their spouse. So, and they generally, if the spouse is not a resident of the United States, so if the spouse is back home in the home country, it is very tough to get an ITIN, but it can be done. And that spouse who's not in the US, if that spouse files with their US resident alien spouse, the spouse in the foreign country is saying to the IRS, I am ready, willing, and able to be subject to US income taxes on my worldwide income. So if you have a non-resident alien, in order for them to be able to file with a US resident alien spouse, they have to file a joint tax return, and the non-resident alien spouse has to agree to be subject to US income taxes on their worldwide income. So I'm not sure that that's the best idea, but in any case, those are the consequences. So the hardest part of this form is up there in that of trying to figure out which box to check. And if you don't check the right box, you could get rejected pretty quickly. The next couple lines are pretty self-evident. First name, middle name, last name. Unfortunately or fortunately, a lot of our immigrants have very long names and sometimes multiple last names. So this does become important to get it right. And what you want to do is we work very hard to make sure all these names and what boxes they're in, whether it's a first name or a middle name or a last name, we want to make sure, and this is, again, more challenging than it first appears, that it's in the correct order, that it's correctly spelled, and it's consistent with your passport or your birth certificate. or your driver's license, or your uh, immigration card, or your visa, or any of your identifying or your marriage license. So I have worked with a lot of immigrants, and often, as we know, names, because people have multiple last names, they get confused on documents. And so think deeply about what names to put in what box here. So make sure it's consistent with those documents. And if somebody already has an ITIN and you're renewing it, make sure it's consistent with their current ITIN letter. So that's the hardest part about names. The next thing is their address. You put their current US mailing address. A foreign address. Most often, the foreign address is left blank. I usually don't have a foreign address. Birth information. That's very important. The date of birth. You want to make sure you get that right. That is important information. And so this is a good question. Somebody's asking about proof of documentation. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Generally speaking, unfortunately, you have to submit original documents. The original passport, the original birth certificate, driver's license. I'm going to talk about the identifying documents. Unless you go to somebody like me, who is a certified acceptance agent and can authenticate documents so that you don't have to file originals. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but that's a good question because you can already see where I'm going. So birth information, put the person's birth date. Make sure you get that correctly. In some birth certificates, they put the year first, so make sure you get that correct. The country of birth. And then here, the city and state of birth, that's optional. So often I won't fill that in because it's optional. You have to put the gender, male or female, and then we get to the line 6A, the country of citizenship. So I just worked with some folks who were from El Salvador, so that's what we put down, their country of citizenship. Foreign tax ID number, often don't have that. I can't remember ever filling that out. I leave that blank. So that usually is blank. Type of US visa, if any, that is often blank. That is filled out for some of my teachers who are here on a visa. But generally for someone who is not authorized, they don't have a visa, so we leave that blank. So the only thing on line 6 that's filled out is the country of citizenship. Otherwise, everything else is blank. Now, your identification documents. So here, you're going to fill out whatever identification documents you're including. The best document to rely on is the passport, and it's got to be a current and a valid passport. So you want that's important that it's current and it's valid, and that's the best document to have because you only need one document. Any other document is not standalone. You need multiple ones. And so that can be frustrating if you don't have a passport. So what I do is I check the passport box or whatever relevant box, and then you fill out who it was issued by. So usually it's by the Republic of El Salvador or Mexico or wherever it's coming from. And then you fill out the number, the expiration date. And then this is often challenging to put on here the date of entry into the United States. So in many cases, people cannot remember the exact date. And so what I try, and the exact date, I've never had one rejected that said that wasn't the date. Likely the federal government doesn't have that date, but in any case, you want this to be consistent with any other documents you've filed. So I usually try to work with the taxpayer to try to remember what year. Usually people can remember the year, and then we try and remember, was it hot, was it cold, and narrow down to what month. And then I'll usually just put the first of the month if we can't figure out what day. And that is usually has not been an issue with taxpayers filing this. Then line 6E is, have you previously received an ITIN? And if it's a first application, then you just say no. If it's a renewal, then you say yes. If it is a renewal, then you fill out line 6F and you put your existing ITIN number. So that's why when I renew it, I have to have the prior ITIN numbers because we want to renew that ITIN number. And usually it's not a problem to get that. Then, whoops, let's go back. So then and this is important under line 6F, you put a name that it was issued to. So if it was issued on a name that's a little bit truncated, then the name that matches the document, go ahead and put that name down. Or I guess if somebody got married so that their current passport has a different last name, you might put the passport and then the marriage certificate to try to explain why there's a name change. So that is it, except taxpayer has to sign this one-page form under penalties of perjury so that we have the taxpayer sign this, and that is the whole form. That's it. It's one page, one size. But the harder part is the documentation.